We're just letting a few people
Yeah.
filter in here over the next couple of minutes. I like to keep these things short,
Yep.
30 minutes. I think you are completely prepared for any question I might have, but
Yep.
obviously, your take on this election and a little brief history lesson over
Sure.
the course of the last 8 years. But we're pretty good. And if there's anything you'd like me to mention, just let me know. And anyone who is in the audience right now, you can actually leave some questions if you'd like in the Q&A, and if we can get to them, we will.
Sounds good.
Good. We'll just give it one more minute. So the newsletter I saw is over 60,000 subscribers now.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's a year old in March. We started March last year, and it's just me. I'm just literally doing it by myself, and I'm having a lot of fun. I ran an organization for a long time, and so it's been fun to have just be me. Right? No staff, no board, no nothing. Just me doing my
Yeah.
thing, and it's been a lot of fun. And we get great. The community is wonderful too. I mean, I think the most enjoyable part in some ways is engaging. In my community, you have to pay to be able to access this daily chat we have, and
Yep.
which keeps the trolls out and keeps the discourse pretty clean also. But we have great conversations, and people share stories about how they're helping a candidate here or doing this, and they learn from each other. It's just been a wonderful part of the experience so far.
That's outstanding. So it's 2 o'clock. So the first question that I
Yeah,
have for you is
sure.
really, a bunch of us were surprised in 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency. He eked
Yeah,
out this electoral college victory. It was not what we were looking for. But I have to say, most of us were not surprised after the first 2 years of the Trump administration in 2018 that the
yeah,
midterms went overwhelming to the Democrats. Not so much a surprise that a Democrat, Joe Biden, could beat him in 2020, particularly after the pandemic. But it was in 2022 when you actually um, were everywhere across social media, trying to convince people that this was not a red wave, that Republicans were not as strong as some of the polls were possibly leading people to believe. But more importantly, because I don't like to dismiss polls out of hand,
agreed.
but I think the pundits were basically buying into this red wave narrative. And you were the one who saw that. You were the one shouting from the rooftops, and it turns out you were right. Now, why were you right?
Yeah, it's important in this business to recognize that, nobody can predict the future, right? I mean, all we're doing is trying to lay out what is the likely scenario based on what we're seeing. And I think in 2022, it was the default likely scenario that Democrats would get beat badly, because that's usually what happens in midterms. And so I think that was sort of the default position. And also, Biden had come down in the fall of 2021. His approval rating was pretty low. And so if you wanted to believe this was going to be a tough year for Democrats, there was plenty of history and data suggesting that was the case. However, there was a lot of this other data suggesting this was going to be a close competitive election. And I think that part of what happened during 2022 is that the kind of default communal belief this was going to be bad for Biden created a far too easily dismissed. It created a culture where the data showing that we might actually do well was too easily dismissed, I think. And that's going to be an admonition to us in this election too, right? Where if you're coming at this election with sort of a bias that it's going to be like some other election, and no election is like any other election. Every election is sui generis and unique, and you have to stay close to the data. In this election, there's plenty of data right now showing Joe Biden, the Democrats, doing well, and Biden has been ahead in more polls recently than you wrote about this the other day, right? And then there's this other data that says Trump is doing better, and so the rational response is to acknowledge that the data is not all pointing in the same direction, that there is this discordant data out there. And that's what I did in 2022. As I said, listen, I understand the argument about why, but here's all this other data. And what we looked at, Tom Bonnier and I and others, Joe Trippi, there was a group of us who worked together on this, was that we saw the heightened Democratic performance in the special elections after Dobbs in the House specials. We saw voter registration turned dramatically towards the Democrats after Dobbs. We saw huge heightened increase in Democratic fundraising. I mean, the June 30th filings in 2022, we were blowing it out against the Republicans. And then the early vote also was performing at a very high level. So there were all these indicators of Democratic intensity. There were no indicators of Republican intensity. And so what we just kept saying was, look, I mean, all this stuff is suggesting that Democrats are going to do far better and than before. And just to put a, sort of a close on that, it's really my view that since the spring of 2022, there's been sort of one election and one political environment. And that's where the Dobbs, I think, sort of broke the Republican Party in some ways in 2022, that a big chunk of Republicans just said at that point, this party's gone too far, it's too much, it's become dangerous. And a big chunk of the Republican Party became loosened from the Republican Party. It doesn't mean they're going to go to Biden or not vote for Trump, but they became loosened. And that the MAGA part of the Republican Party is struggling to bring that part of the party along. And so what we've seen in election after election is Democrats overperforming expectations, Republicans struggling. And I would argue that that same basic dynamic is carried over into 2024 as well.
So as we look ahead to November, there are at least 3 swing states. I believe it's Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania that will have abortion initiatives on the ballot at this point.
Yep.
And obviously we had the news last week of Arizona,
yep,
with this 160-year-old zombie law, returning, which is kind of amazing. But it seems, if this holds true, and really when you talk about data, we've seen nothing since the Supreme Court's decision. We've seen nothing to indicate that it won't hold. How does Donald Trump win those states?
Well, I think this is important, right? I mean, part of what I said during 2022 is that I felt that in 2024, the political pain for Republicans in abortion was going to get worse, because because there are 2 pieces of this, right? There's Dobbs, and then there's the extreme abortion laws being passed in the states, right? And because the second set of things didn't have to happen, right? We didn't have to have the Idaho ban. We didn't have to have the 1864. We didn't have to have 6-week abortion ban in Florida. Those things were things Republicans chose to do when Dobbs ended, or the trigger laws were already in effect, anticipating Dobbs ending. And what's happened, I think, on abortion is that it's not going to, in anything, it's actually getting much more intense, because I think the outrage around the fact that millions of women in Arizona and Florida who have up until very recently enjoyed full reproductive freedom and no interference in their lives by the government, now are going to have their rights and freedom stripped away in the coming weeks. And so if you were worried about MAGA in 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2023, and the version of MAGA that's the iteration of MAGA in 2024 feels more dangerous and extreme than even before. And I think that what's happened in Arizona and in Florida in the last few weeks has confirmed that MAGA is escalating, that it's continuing to take rights and freedoms away from Americans. It's not receding. And I think one thing I talked about on Lawrence O'Donnell last night is that I think Trump's management of this issue over the last few weeks has been comical and buffoonish and absurd, right? And because I think he is I think my own view is that he's diminished, and he's doing things that I'm often finding myself use the word, idiocy or idiotic to describe what he's doing. What he claimed he did last Monday was to come out and be sort of a moderate, right? Well, I'm going to let the states decide. But what he actually did, and I don't even know if he understands this, is he actually endorsed the most extreme abortion restrictions in the country. He endorsed Idaho. And Idaho, by the way, not only has no exceptions, but it has the trafficking law where you can be, if you bring a minor across a border into another state to get an abortion, you can be arrested. It has, doctors getting arrested, right? It's the most extreme manifestation of this. Trump endorsed that. Trump said he's okay with that. And if he's okay with Florida and Arizona, now he's backtracking in Arizona, right? But if he's okay with these extremist abortion laws anywhere, then he's okay with them everywhere. And I don't think that they understand how much Trump basically probably created for the Democrats now 20% more money than we were going to have before, and probably 20 to 30% more volunteer time that we had before, because there's a sense that MAGA is escalating and getting more dangerous. And so I think I think Trump is having a really bad month. And if he loses the election, I think we're going to look back at this period as the time when he began to lose the election.
So you mentioned fundraising as an important signal, and you
Yeah.
saw that back in 2022.
Yeah.
Well, right now it's hands down. Democrats seem to be able to raise money like
Yep.
nobody's business, and Trump is having a hard time. So much
Yep.
so that he had to have a bunch of billionaires to a Palm Beach fundraiser, which he claims raised $50 million.
Yeah.
But of
Yeah.
course, there's no proof of that,
Yeah.
nor will we probably ever see proof of that.
Yeah.
But it seems like Trump's in real trouble there, fundraising wise.
Listen, there's an interesting question that I've begun to wonder about whether or not this loosening of the chunk of the Republican Party that I described earlier is creating a hard dollar fundraising crisis in the Republican Party, meaning that Trump may have his core 40, right? He told Nikki Haley voters to get lost. He says, he insulted Nikki Haley, right? He said, I don't want them. I got my guys, I got my people. But the question of whether or not the Haley voters and the never MAGA, never Trumpers, the loose Republicans, which let's say is 20 to 30%, let's just say 20% of the Republican vote. The question is whether or not those people are also all the hard dollar donors to the Republican Party. And
Right.
that are we really beginning to see the evidence of what happens when you alienate the establishment wing of the Republican Party, that you're creating a hard dollar fundraising crisis, for the Republicans, whereas our hard dollar apparatus is bigger and more powerful than it's ever been. I mean, we're growing the most powerful democratic machine that we've ever had, because it's not just money, it's all this volunteer time that people are giving through phone calls and texting and postcarding and all this stuff. And so you have this contrast, I think it's going to become much more apparent that you've got this superpowered democratic fundraising and volunteer base building the most powerful Democrat hard dollar apparatus we've ever had, building the biggest campaigns, allowing us to control the information environment, pushing our performance on the ground to the upper end of what's possible. And you've got this atrophied hard dollar world on the right. Now, why does that matter? I mean, Taegan, that all money isn't equal. With hard dollars, you get what's called lowest unit rate. I mean, you pay the lowest money for television ads. And in the general election, a super PAC is going to have to spend between 5 and 7 times what a hard dollar ad costs to equate to get the same amount of eyeballs, which means that, and so what happened in 2022, whereas Republicans spent more money than we did, but we spent more hard dollars than they did, we actually reached more voters with our ads than Republicans did.
Right.
So it's very inefficient. You can't make up lost ground with super PAC dollars. And this is why this whole idea that, well, Trump's just got a bunch of billionaires and he can make up lost ground. I would say 2 things as somebody who's been through this and been doing this a long time. One is the Trump campaign is now past the point where they can build a serious general election campaign. It's too late. They needed to be building this for months and months and months. They just run out of time. They're not going to be able to build it fast enough. And the second thing is that, they can't make up, it's going to be very difficult for them to get competitive on hard dollars, meaning that we're going to be putting more ads on the air in these battleground states and these battleground Senate and House races because of the hard dollar crisis Republicans are seemingly undergoing right now. These are deeply consequential things. I mean, these are the kinds of things that cause political parties to lose elections, right? Being outspent 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, having less powerful grassroots. And so this is an important part of, what I think we all need, those of us who are following this stuff closely, we need to be paying attention to this stuff.
Well, the one thing when you talk about campaign infrastructure, the one thing that's really struck me over the course of the last week or so has been how responsive the Biden campaign has been to any abortion news. With the Arizona decision immediately, I mean, they were ready. I mean, they were ready for all of this.
Yeah.
And, your point about Donald Trump taking a position, which is actually one of the most conservative positions around, because he essentially endorses these draconian laws in the states by letting the states decide, is really extraordinary. But the Biden campaign was ready for it.
Yeah, look, this one of the craziest parts of the red wave fiasco in 2022 was that there were lots of commentators in the final few weeks of the election saying, well, I guess, women care more about eggs costing 30 cents more than they used to than losing their reproductive rights and freedoms. And it was always when I would watch this stuff in real time, I was like, what election are you in, right? Like you're in some other planet than the actual election that is taking place. And yeah, this is very foundational stuff. I mean, look, the Republicans, I'll say this is that I think for all of you who are trying to make sense of the election, remember there are two big things that have happened since 2020 that I think make 2024 very different than 2016 or 2020. And I don't think that this election, I think that one of the things I would just say to everybody is that I think whenever you hear a commentator say this election is like this election, you should almost immediately dismiss what they're saying because
Yeah.
no election is like any other election, right? Every election is unique and it's got its own contours, and that's kind of a lazy way of, reporting. And I think that two things have happened for the Republican Party since 2020. One is, the Republican Party tried to overturn an American election and end American democracy for all time.
Just
And
a small little thing like that.
right. And the second thing is they've stripped the rights and freedoms away of more than half the population of the United States. Each of those things could keep them out of power for a long time. And they've done both of them. And I think that I think to have any kind of accurate understanding of what's about to happen is that, there are a lot of Americans who feel that the Republican Party is a grave danger to them, to the country, to their rights and freedoms. And they're right. And this stuff is really taking this election and taking it out of, I often say that the most powerful force in American politics going back to 2018 has been fear and opposition to MAGA. That's likely to be the most powerful force. And it's going to be more powerful than any disappointment in Joe Biden, in my view, that's likely to be. And I think the last 10 days has reaffirmed to many voters the danger that MAGA represented. I mean, I wrote a memo in October of 2021 saying I thought the election would be close and competitive because for three reasons, right? One is that Republicans were going to do enough things to remind the anti-MAGA majority of who they were. They had just lost the last two elections. Second is that Biden had been a good president. We were going to have a good argument to make. And third was this stuff I was talking about, how we have more tools to mitigate midterm drop off and push our performance to the upper end of what's possible than we've ever had. And that's sort of what happened in the election. But to me, the trigger was, would the Republicans do things that would remind people of what they don't like about MAGA? Would they reaffirm MAGA-ness, right, to the primacy of MAGA-ness? And it happened through Dobbs. It happened through the Uvalde shooting in 2022. It happened through a series, the Liz Cheney's hearings that happened. There was a series of things that reminded voters about the ugliness of MAGA. Well, the last few weeks, we've had really powerful reminders of the ugliness of MAGA. And I think I think that Joe Biden was already coming up in the polls. You wrote about this last week, right? I mean, the election now today is clear, close and competitive with Biden having a little bit of momentum. I think it's very possible that what's happened between his hysterical performance in court and the abortion restrictions, this could be another point or two in the race in my view, but we'll see. I mean, look, what's amazing about this election is we got a long way to go. It's going to change 20 times and, nobody has any idea what's going to happen. But my fundamental view about where we are is that I would much rather be us than them at this point.
Yeah. And your point is the fact that we're having this discussion and the fact that people talk about it being a close race. I mean, meanwhile, Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, is having trouble staying awake in court as he faces criminal trial.
2 days in a row, by the way. I mean, and by the way, he fell asleep on Monday before lunch, right? That was to me the most amazing, right? Like he didn't even get through, maybe he was hungry, right? And got a little, with sugar, he was a little sugar deprived, but he fell asleep before lunch. I mean, the trial only started at 9:30 or 10 o'clock and he was asleep by, noon. And I just think it's a reminder. I think one of the most interesting things about this election, I think there's a 25% chance that this is a blowout for Biden, that we win it by 8 to 10 points. It's not the likely scenario, but it's certainly possible because I do think there's a little bit of an emperor has no clothes, or as I say, the orange emperor has no clothes, thing going on here, where somehow we all had this impression because of this early polling data that Trump was strong and he was mighty, when it turns out he's actually, like the wizard, the emperor, the wizard of the old man behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz, or the emperor has no clothes. He's actually weak and
Right.
diminished and not raising money, and the campaign's a mess, and he's in court, and the RNC is in turmoil, and there's a mass exodus of Republicans out of the House, and his agenda is far more extreme and dangerous than it was before, and he's a serial criminal, facing hundreds of millions of dollars of fines and everything else. Like, this is the ugliest political thing we've all ever seen. And to have gotten to a point collectively where we were pretending that it wasn't ugly, that this was somehow going to be something, because one of the ways I like to describe this is that all the challenges that the Biden world have are challenges that I think can be solved and managed within the normal bounds of a political campaign, right? Running
Yeah.
coalitions to win are really hard. You're going to have bumps along the way. Groups are going to be angry, right? The question is, how do you manage it? There are going to be all sorts of issues. It's like a balance sheet. You got assets and you got liabilities. I think the Biden campaign can manage all their problems. I don't know how you make Trump look like a serious presidential candidate again. I just think it's outside of the bounds of what we can do in our business, right? And they're going to try, but I think he's doing everything he can to make it hard for them right now.
Yeah, I couldn't, and that's why I think this trial is actually a much bigger deal than most people have been making it, because I mean the charges are, and his behavior is so extraordinary, that it's just going to remind a lot of people about the type of character that he has, the type of person that he has. When you go back to 2018, when the story of this hush money broke, it was a big deal in the polls. People were very concerned about it, and I just think that a lot of people are going to be reminded of that. Before time runs out, though, I've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I'd love to get to
Sure.
them. So a quick one. How concerned are you about Robert Kennedy pulling votes from Biden in swing states?
Yeah, look, we have to, Democrats, I think we've learned our lesson from 2000 and 2016 that we can't take any of this stuff for granted. I think you're going to see, us frontally engaging Kennedy, and this is not going to be something that's, look, our opponent is Donald Trump, right? I mean, that's where 80-90% of our attention has to be. However, we are going to, I think, engage Kennedy and define him. And I think that he's a ridiculous candidate. I'm not scared by him. He's got enormous problems. And I think it means that within the normal bounds of a political campaign, we're going to be able to do a lot to degrade him with voters. But he's a factor, and we have to take it seriously. I think the Democrats are clearly taking it seriously. I don't think there's any effort, but I don't think that he's a better idea of a candidate than he is a reality.
Mhm.
And he's better on paper than he is in his actual performance. And he's got a lot of really loony views that are going to be, in a very easy transaction with voters, are going to be disqualifiers for him. Most importantly, in some ways, in the last few weeks, he's taken very, very pro-Russian and Putin views. He used the term denazification to describe what Putin was trying to do in Ukraine. That's language that's not used on the right. That's language that's used by Vladimir Putin. And he's staked out ground on the Russia issue that has firmly put him in a place, as being a pro-Putin advocate, which I just think is an unacceptable position in the country. I mean, I think Putin's approval rating in the U.S. is 5%, right? And so I've been a little surprised at that. I mean, a lot of the other stuff, the anti-vax stuff, I mean, like we all knew was coming. His sort of direct kind of aping of Putin's most ridiculous propaganda language has been shocking to me, and I think it's going to be shocking to a lot of people that don't know much about him as well.
So if there are presidential debates, you would not mind him being on the debate
No, he's
stage?
not going to be on the ballot. I mean, he's not going to be in the debate. You have to get to 15%, and he's now, polling at 7-8% in recent polling. So he's not going to make the debate. I don't know that there are going to be debates
Yeah.
anyway, right? But if they were, he has zero chance of getting on the debate stage. And so we're already past that point. Like, there's no possibility unless there's some kind of collapse in Biden, or I mean, this whole idea that there is like this whole group of unavailable vote, of available voters are outside the two parties, sort of
Right.
the no
I
labels
agree.
myth, right? Yeah, it's always been myth. And he's already dropped. I mean, some analyst showed this, his average numbers in the polls. He's now down to, he was at 14 in the fall, and now he's down to 8, and he's dropping like a point or two every month. My guess is he will be consistently at 4 or 5%, soon. And in some of the polls, by the way, where they don't name him, right, where they say, will you vote for Biden and Trump? And then other candidates, those other candidates in some of the weekly tracking polls are getting 2%, 3% of the vote, right? So that's a sign that the actual, no, he's, when you don't name him, his
Right.
not, the numbers are much worse, which shows that this may actually be a much smaller vote than prompted.
That's a good point. How about younger voters? Are you concerned about
Yeah,
younger voters coming out,
there's a
or is it too
yeah,
early? These polls are showing
yeah. I think,
Biden without support, but is it too early for that
listen,
right now?
a big chunk of our coalition has wandered from us, right? I mean, if our coalition was all together, Biden would be at 51%, right? He's not, and he's in the low to mid 40s in polling. And so, some sizable chunk of the Biden 2020 coalition has wandered. I think in general, the way that we have viewed this, I agree with the campaign's analysis of this, is that we always believe that once the general election began and the campaign turned on and we started really engaging voters and people understood it was Biden versus Trump, that a big chunk of the Biden coalition would come home. And that's beginning to happen. I mean, I think that's how we're gaining ground. Even Nate Cohn in the Times, in his analysis of how Biden gained 4 points in his poll over the last few weeks, was that the Democratic coalition was beginning to come home. And so that includes young voters, that includes African American voters and Hispanic voters. Yeah, we're not where we want to be. I do think, though, that we have a strong case to make to them, and I don't think that Trump does. And so I think that, again, with sustained engagement in a campaign where we're talking to voters now for many months in an aggressive format, I think we can go get done what we need to go get done. But we have work to do. I want to be very clear. We have a lot of work to do. We're not where we want to be. I'm not being Pollyannish here. This isn't a slam dunk. I mean, the election's dead even right now, right? But we're not losing. And I also, because this will come up potentially, what about the swing states? There's been very little polling. The reason I write about national polls so much is we have a lot of national polling. I mean, there's a lot
Yeah.
of data, and you can go into it and look at it. There is very little polling in the swing states and the battlegrounds. And much of the polling that's been done has actually been center right or Republican aligned, polling outfits, and so, or people who pay the bills. And so I don't think we have a lot of good data in the swing states. And I would just say that, there are polls in the last few weeks showing Biden ahead in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We had 2 very good polls in North Carolina last week that show the race within margin of error. And one of them, the Quinnipiac poll, had Josh Stein up by 8 points in North Carolina, which, if that happens, Biden's going to win there, in my view.
Yeah, I
And
agree. Yeah.
so, I think the state polling is not nearly as dire, as many have argued. And I think the final thing for those of you, because I know there's a lot of people pay close attention on here today, is that you have to be a little bit wary of poll averages. And this is part of what went wrong in 2022. The Real Clear Politics final polling averages, which is supposed to be an independent measure, had the Republicans at 54 seats in the Senate, right? Based on the averages. Well, what happened, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. I mean, the thing is, if you have 4 polls that show Biden ahead by a point and 1 poll showing Trump ahead by 6, then in the average, Trump's actually ahead, right?
Yeah.
And, because, these outlier polls that are usually funded by Republican organizations yank the polling averages over a point, 2 or 3 from where they really are. And I think if you spend your life looking at Real Clear Politics, you're not looking at reality about where that certainly wasn't true in 2022. I mean, the Real Clear Politics averages, in my view, are probably 2 to 3 points more Republican than the reality of independent polling. That's what we saw. I mean, we saw this very vividly in 2022, that there was one election that Real Clear Politics was telling you was there, and then there was the election that happened. And the polling was, if you looked at independent polling in the final few weeks, you saw a close competitive election. You looked at all these junky Republican polls that were +4, +5 Republican, you ended up over here. And so it's another reason why, on my Twitter feed, whenever anybody sends me RCP, data, I immediately block them. It's an immediate block because it's disinformation in essence. And so people have to be careful of the polling averages as a tool. What's better to do, so I'll give you an example. If you go to 538 and look at the congressional generic, 2/3 of the congressional generics taken in the last few weeks have Democrats ahead, even though the average is 0 right now, in part because there's a bunch of very Republican polls that have it +4, +5, +6, which pushes the average over. But if you look at it in another way, which is let's put all the, 2/3 of the polls show, Democrats ahead. So I think be careful of the polling averages. It's a little bit of it can become misleading based on garbage in, garbage out principles, where there's been a significant increase in Republican funded polling that tends to be a little bit more Republican than the independent polls. And so the averages can get yanked a little bit to the right, inadvertently, I think.
Yeah, it's just like
Or
everything.
on purpose, by the way, or on purpose.
Or on
Yeah,
purpose. It's
yeah,
just like everything else in the digital world.
yeah,
Things get spammed after a while, and they're spamming the polling averages.
yeah.
What do you make of Donald Trump's consistent underperformance in the primaries?
Well,
Um,
it's consistent with the argument I was making earlier that I think that my explanation, and it's an explanation, it doesn't mean that I'm right, but it's my explanation, is that there is a chunk of the Republican Party. Ron Brownson claims it's 20% of the Republicans that are non-MAGA, that their distance from MAGA has grown. I mean, part of the reason why Republican candidates in 2022 did so poorly in the battleground Senate races was that they were unable to bring the non-MAGA part of the Republican Party along, right? And that there was a resistance. You had in many of these states, you had Republicans, prominent Republican elected officials, endorsing the Democrats and giving permission structure for Republicans to not vote Republican. And when you think of the third party, rogue party, splinter party movements this cycle, you always should start with not Kennedy, but you should start with the Never Trump or Never MAGAs, because they played a major role in 2022. And if in this election somehow we end up in October having Mitt Romney and George Bush and Liz Cheney and campaigning for Biden or campaigning against Trump, right? However, wherever that line is going to be, there's going to be there's an unprecedented rebellion happening in the Republican Party against Trump right now.
it
I mean,
really
to
is,
have
yeah.
two former vice presidents come out against him, to have Mitt Romney, the former nominee. I still think there's a chance that George Bush may jump in and wade into all of this, given the fact that Cheney already went, right? And so you have this unprecedented permission structure being given to Republicans to not vote Republican. And they're being told to not vote Republican because it could mean the end of the country and the democracy that we live in. This is a pretty compelling argument, right? Coming from, particularly Reagan era Republican leading officials who have strong connection to democracy promotion and helping free closed societies from the grip of communism, right? And so I think one of the biggest things for all of us to pay attention to is, does the Biden campaign create this kind of temporary pro-democracy coalition and bring, if we are in a parliamentary system, what would have already happened is that the Nationalist Party would have split off from the center right party, and center right party would be in our coalition, our governing coalition. Liz Cheney would be in our cabinet, that kind of stuff. That stuff probably would have happened already in a parliamentary system. Our system doesn't work that way. But the question is, can we create a virtual version of that to get us through the election, a temporary arrangement where we're giving the most powerful permission structure possible to Republicans who are unhappy with MAGA to not vote for Trump. To me, I've been using this, and I'll end up here thinking, is that I keep coming back to this term idiocy or idiotic. The Trump telling Haley voters to get lost was about as idiotic a thing we've ever seen a presidential candidate do since we've all been in this business, right? I mean, he needs those voters. He didn't win last time. And they're already there was already in the polling clear data that Haley voters were not just not interested in voting for him, but there was an openness to vote for Biden, which was surprising to me, to be honest. And these are Republican voters. This idea these were all Democrats who crossed over, that was not true. That was a Republican talking point to minimize what they were seeing in their own data. And so for Trump to have not managed that more adroitly, to recognizing the clear existential threat. I mean, if you go back to Iowa, and I'll close with this, 20% of Iowans, and there were no Democrats who voted in the Iowa caucus, right? 20% of Republicans in a caucus who voted said they voted for Haley, and 43% of them said they would vote for Biden. You know, that's 5% of the 4 to 5% of the entire electorate we're talking about. If that actually happens, Biden's going to win this election by 8 to 10 points, right? And so this is a huge existential threat to Trump. And how did he manage it, right? He said, bring it on. I love it, right? I don't want you guys part of my party. What in the world are you doing? And I think that one of the things that we have to I'm going to write a piece on this next week. I'm not going to have time this week, but the combination of the way that Trump managed the border issue, where they had a clear advantage, and now we're the party that wants to bring order to the border, and they're the party that's for chaos. This issue, the thing he did with Nikki Haley, the idiocy of his abortion stance last Monday, him now coming out and saying, I was never for rolling back the ACA. That's something Biden has made up. I mean, we have the tweets, we have the video. I mean, he said it a million times, right? I mean, he's making the kind of political mistakes again and again and again that a candidate who loses makes. And I think to sort of deny the fact that he is now backpedaling on abortion, backpedaling on the ACA, he's going to at some point start backpedaling on the insult to the Haley voters because he just has to. His impulsivity, his lack of discipline has become, I think, a really major issue in the election because he keeps saying and doing things that are the kinds of things that candidates who lose elections do. And he's not just doing one of them, he's doing many of them. And you just don't get to make that many mistakes to still win.
That's a great point. Do you mind if I ask you one more question?
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned that, the possibility that Biden could win by 8 to 10 points if things go his way. Would that be enough to swing a couple Senate races, like in Florida, perhaps, or Texas?
I'm skeptical about Florida and Texas. I think we have to keep our eye on it. I think the amount of money that it would require, if these were smaller states, then it would be easier to imagine us going in hard late and trying to flip, right? But they're so big and so expensive. I do have to say that I think we can't, of the two of those, I think to me, the Texas race in some ways is the more interesting of the two, because I think Allard is outperforming expectations, right? His fundraising, his performance on the stump, his just general, there's a sense that he's really bringing it and running an amazing campaign. And Ted Cruz is a terrible candidate. He's a terrible candidate who did poorly 6 years ago. He's just kind of an atrocious human being. And I think that, I think that race is going to stay close. I think it's going to stay. And remember, Biden only lost Texas by 5 points last time, right? Yeah. And so, this idea that Texas, every time Abbott's on the ballot, they win by a lot. Every time Abbott's not on the ballot, we've gotten Texas gets a lot closer. And, Abbott's been, I think we're going to look back and realize that Abbott was a sort of a titanic figure during this period. But when he wasn't on the ballot, things shrunk up. We'll see. I don't know. I mean, I'm open-minded to other states coming in play because it always happens, right? It's always the nature of our game, right? There's always a Senate race or a governor's race or a few House races that nobody saw coming. And so you have to be open to that. I do think Florida also has the added wild card of the fact that the 6-week abortion ban, which the Republicans are now going to have to defend in Florida, polls at about 22%. And I know, and I mean, this is what I mean. Like, this is why Trump sort of staking out this extremist position on abortion is so ridiculous. I'm sure the 1864 ban polls at like 15%, right? In Arizona. And Trump's going to have to defend the 6-week abortion ban in Florida. And, that nationally, my guess is that polls at 25%, 28%, maybe somewhere in the 20s. There's never been an issue since you and I have been in this business, right? There's never been an issue where a major political party on an issue that matters to voters is polling in the 20s. This just never happened. There's never been every issue polls in the 40s and 50s, right? Everything is in the middle somewhere, right?
Right.
Now, Donald Trump is going to be having to defend an issue that is really important to a really big chunk of the electorate that polls it in the 20s. And, and that's why they're backpedaling hysterically, frenetically on abortion, because they've come to realize how politically deadly this is to them. And it should be, though. I mean, stripping the rights and freedoms away of more than half the population that have been long held, and by the way, that are common in every modern country in the world. I mean, even Mexico and Brazil, you now have more right to abortion in Mexico and Brazil than you do in the United States and many Latin American countries. It's absurd. And this is an indefensible position, the Republican Party. And I think the only middle ground for them, there actually isn't a middle ground in this position. This is why Trump struggled, is they try to find this middle ground. They made a decision the 15-week ban wasn't good for whatever reason. Then they came up with this other absurd place, because there's no middle ground. There's only one position, which is you want a woman and a doctor to make, and their family to make these decisions. Anywhere else you go, you end up imposing the government and men into the process of making that decision. And then the numbers fall out from a polling standpoint. So there isn't really a safe harbor for Republicans on this. There's no escape hatch on this issue for them. There's going to have to be capitulation and retreat, which you could argue Trump began a little bit, but he actually made it worse, because it's not really clear he really has any idea what he's doing anymore. And so, I think the Republicans are in real trouble. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that can keep a political party out of power for a long time. And the Republicans, as we mentioned earlier, have done two of these things. And so I think that, I look at all this as an analyst, right? And you expand the aperture beyond polling to allow to look at things like, when you buy a house, you don't just buy it based on price. You buy it based on location and the kitchen and the light and how big the basement is and all these other things, right? We have a lot more data available to us and information available to us than just polling. And we've become too polling centric, in my view, about how we analyze the relative health and strength of the two political parties. We can be more agile than just looking at a few polls, right? Polls matter, but so does all this other stuff too, right? It matters too.
That's a great way to end it. I really appreciate you joining us and answering so many questions. Opium Chronicle.
Yeah.
Sign up for it if you haven't. The 61,000 subscribers, as I just saw.
I know, it's crazy. It's free. I mean, you can go to a higher level, just like with your site, but it's free. And I publish 6 days a week, not as much as you do, but publish 6 days a week. And the water's warm. We're having a lot of fun, and very much appreciate the work that you do, Taegan, to try to keep solid, firm, information flowing in a time of the degraded information environment that we live in. And so just thank you for what you do every day. I really am grateful for it.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for joining us. I hope we can do it again.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.